Okay, so we heard the music. It's time. And this session will end on time for the coffee break. So we do want to get started so you have enough time for all of your questions. This is the penultimate session on governance of data spaces, control and ownership of data services and infrastructures, and the possible roles of the FDO Forum. We have 4 panelists. Each one is going to speak for about 7 minutes. Then you've seen this before, come up here for some questions, and then there will be time for some Q&A. In fact, I'll cut my questions a bit shorter to give all of you that space. People are still going to be coming in after savoring their carrot soup and sandwich wraps, so please, we'll be kind and make space for them and ignore any ruffling of things. So first up, I'd like to invite Mark Leggott, who's the Director of International Relations for the Digital Research Alliance of Canada.
Well, hello everyone. It's great to be here and see a lot of familiar faces and friends. It's the second or third time I've been in the Netherlands, so I did want to thank our hosts and the people of the Netherlands, because it's been such a pleasure for me over the last five days or so that I've been here to walk around the city and enjoy such a wonderful place. So I did want to say thanks for that. So Mark Leggott, I'm from the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, which is a brand new organization. We're 2.5 years old. We were created 4 years ago to be a national organization to take on responsibility for funding and providing services for high-performance computing, research software, and data management. I was previously the executive director for an organization called Research Data Canada, so I kind of came from the data context, but as the director of international relations now, I kind of span across those 3 pillars, and I also include a 4th pillar of cybersecurity. So I'm very schizophrenic these days. But I did want to, before I got into this context, and it's going to feel like I'm going down a real rabbit hole here, but bear with me. Before I came into this field, I was a biologist, and I was closer in vintage to Darwin than some of you in the crowd here. So I studied kind of natural history things, and one of the courses I took was on the kind of the origin of metazoans and the fundamental body shape that led to all these things like starfish and elephants and all the different multicellular organisms we see. And scientists kind of agree, but as we all know, there's lots of disagreement about whether or not that kind of fundamental or original body shape was a tube with a place for the food to come in and a place at the other end for the things not needed to leave. So generally, people agree that that's the shape that led to all these multicellular creatures. So for me, the FDO is that fundamental or canonical body shape that led to all the diversity, birds, insects, all of those things. So for me, that's a good analogy because it's a really complicated ecosystem of organisms. So how do we go from that FDO or tube body shape to all of the richness and diversity that's represented in our ecosystem? Not only how do we make sense of it, but how do we achieve something like interoperability between all of those different components that arise from that simple progenitor? So I just maybe give you an opportunity to think about that because it's been rolling around in my brain for the last 3 days. The other biological analogy, and I'll bring these back, that I've been finding very useful. I don't know if you get the cicada in the Netherlands, the 13-year, 17-year, known as the periodical cicada, 17-year locust. So I think we're experiencing one of those 13-year explosions of ideas and Bob Kahn and his colleagues were another one, that kind of genesis of the basic ideas and the research ideas that then led to 13 years of an explosion of development and that diversity that we see from that fundamental body plan. So I mention those two because I don't think any of us would agree that that diversity is too complex or not too important that we can not pay attention to it. So we're in Naturalis. Biodiversity is a key aspect of what they do here at Naturalis. So I think we should kind of embrace that biodiversity concept in the FDO context. And for me, what that means is a couple of things. So embrace the diversity of platforms. Yesterday, Nicholas kind of commented on embrace the silos. I would say embrace the diversity of species and platforms and things that exist in our ecosystem, and focus on building specific partnerships where those partnerships make sense. Embrace what has been done in the past. I read Kahn and Walensky and Payette and Lugosi and a lot of the papers that led to some of the digital library kind of systems that we see. I embraced Fedora as the platform that came out of that digital object work and built an interface on top of Fedora because it was simple and it was designed to be a reference architecture, if you will, for this digital object architecture. The Fedora object model is beautiful. It's elegant, it's simple. There are a number of frameworks that have been built around it. It's essentially the FDO, from my perspective. Again, as somebody who's closer in age or goes back further, closer to Darwin than the more modern developments. So when I listen to some of the conversations, I go, we need to understand not just what was done in that example, but also what can we learn from the things that didn't work in that Payette, Lugosi object model and colleagues, as well as the Fedora implementation of what that meant. So we need to learn from what's happened in the past. In other words, we need to define what is missing. So right now, I get the sense that the FDO and a lot of it's been a fascinating few days in conversation, and I think we're talking about a specification that is emerging, doesn't exist yet. So I think we should consider those experiments and those real-world platforms that exist. What did they do well? What's missing? What are the technologies and APIs and PIDs, all the things that they work with and do well? Recognize and accept the external factors we can control. We realize there's going to be this kind of 13 or 17-year cycle of ideas that platforms that come from some new and brilliant ideas, but we can't control. How many here are Ruby developers? There's one, so there's a great example. Ruby was the platform to use. I don't know how many years ago it was, but all these platforms came up based on Ruby. Ruby doesn't get used very much these days. So whereas biodiversity and the natural world works at a Darwinian natural selection pace, our universe works at a much faster pace. But we can't control things like new programming languages, new platforms, new technologies, new PIDs. The W3C is an elegant definition for something called DIDs, or distributed IDs. Very interesting in this space, but it completely encompasses, overshadows, whatever adjective you want to use, our traditional ideas of PID space with DOIs and ORCIDs and the like. So lots of interesting stuff there. So again, recognize and accept the external factors we can't control. Let those Ruby platforms bloom and learn from them. Use an open forum. There's been lots of discussion about how we move this conversation forward. Ingrid will make some comments, and as well as I'm sure other colleagues on the panel will, about organizations like RDA that are built to facilitate community collaboration and produce outputs that then go on to do other good things. And then the final two comments I would make, the two examples that, excuse me, I find especially interesting. There's a new PID, newish PID that isn't being used much right now, called RAID, Research Activity ID. For me, it's one of the most important PIDs. I call it the PID for the PIDs. So it's basically a container for PIDs associated with a research activity, like a project. I agreed to sit on the ISO technical subcommittee without understanding what that meant, and it's excruciating. I'd be happy to swap stories with colleagues that have sat on ISO technical subcommittees. But what it meant was the Australian Research Data Commons team that had kind of developed the idea for RAID at a university, and it started to develop out of there, recognized that in order to get buy-in from the community, they had to go through a process like ISO. So I suspect you're going to see a lot of examples of RAIDs coming up in the next year. The other example that I like is the Smart API, which was developed out of an NIH series of grants, and it's an API approach that makes all APIs fair. So it's a way to make your API fair and machine readable and accessible. Who here uses the Smart API? A couple. A brilliant idea that nobody uses, the verification of APIs. So there's a lot of technology and a lot of things in our ecosystem that could benefit us in the FDO context. So I just wanted to mention those.
Thank you so much, Mark. And we'd be happy to use your experience on the ISO committee. We're working with DIN, so if you want to be on some other committees, let us know. Next, I'd like to invite up Franciska de Jong, who's here as Director of CLARIN.
Thank you. Yeah, okay. Where is the place where I'm not blinded by by the lights? Okay, let's see. So, yeah, good afternoon. I must say I just arrived. I was invited to replace somebody who has COVID, so I did not attend the rest of the program. But it was not for nothing that I was invited, so I won't be an alien. But if I miss the context, then let me know. I maybe can fill in. So I'm the director of one of Europe's ERICs, a so-called European Research Infrastructure Consortium. It's the research infrastructure for language resources. We are an organization that is giving access to language resources, data and tools in all kinds of repositories across Europe and even elsewhere, South Africa, United States. We do that from the conviction that the diversity of language materials and tools to process the diversity is an important objective. So the whole model behind CLARIN is not only given in by the need that you see in many disciplines to have a research infrastructure to be able to handle the digital objects, but an important driver is, and that's a nice alignment with what Mark was telling, but the diversity issues that play a role in the kind of data that we're concerned with. So Europe is multilingual by default, but we don't just limit our attention to the languages of Europe. There are thousands of languages for which materials can be found through CLARIN. It's a distributed model, so the data sits where they are. We just give access to the materials through standardization of metadata. So it's interoperability to allow access to very diverse types of data, not just in terms of languages, but also in terms of format, so text, speech, video, etc., is an important goal for the whole initiative. And I think it's fair to say that because of the design of CLARIN, which was, by the way, partly inspired by the bright mind of Peter Wittenberg, so he was involved in the very early days. You could say that CLARIN was fair avant la lettre, or at least was working towards fairness avant la lettre. Metadata interoperability, access protocols all with the purpose of giving access to the materials with good licenses so that it could be reused. More recently, we integrated a Fair Digital Object Gateway into our platform. So there is a discovery platform, faceted, so you can select for languages and topics and even research scenarios, etc. But an important aspect in the way we position ourselves in the wider landscape is the fact that we strongly collaborate with other ERICs or other research infrastructures. ERIC is a legal entity type, doesn't matter so much if you're an ERIC or something else. But we work together with, first of all, with the other research infrastructures in the domain of social sciences and humanities. And this has led, for example, to collaboration on training, collaboration on a joint discovery platform called the SSH Open Marketplace, which is still very young, but will grow in importance. And again, there you see the attention for diversity and also the possibility to combine types of data. So, for example, to combine textual materials with survey data and to make sure that sensitive data can also be part of the service offer. This collaboration has learned us a lot about the fact that these European organizations, because we're all European organizations, that they are an excellent vehicle for to support the scientific agendas, because we are based in many countries. We have institutes in many countries, but the whole purpose is to collaborate across the borders of countries and the borders of languages. So the scientific agendas are typically also doing that, and the research infrastructures support that dynamics. So it's all inspired by scientific considerations, and of course we also pay attention to audiences beyond academia. But I underline this because we've seen that this model has been very powerful, because on the one hand we have the roots in our individual disciplines and are able to reach out to the communities of use, and that's not at all a solved issue, because for the social science and humanities alone there are 500,000 researchers or professional users in Europe alone, and we haven't reached them all, of course, but we do have the connections with the nodes in the countries, and through this common scientific agenda or a scholarly agenda, we are able to support the thing that is crucial for science, namely collaboration across borders. The cluster for the SSH domain, the social science and humanities domain, is called SHOC, SSH Open Cluster. But there are more of those clusters. There are 5 of them organized in a similar way in the European context. So one for astronomy, one for life sciences, one for environmental studies, one for physics. And the clusters have all similar structure and similar governance models and similar funding models, because the ERICs are paid for by the member countries. So we have a lot of things in common, which helps us to develop a strategy for how to position ourselves in the European landscape and also towards the national policies. But it's maybe good to mention that in many of those policy discussions, the fact that these clusters and the individual research infrastructures do exist and do have the connection with their user communities and do have use cases is not always well understood. In a way, you could say that they are hidden players that could play an enormous role in accelerating the development of a landscape with fair digital objects, because we do it already on a smaller scale, and even though not perfect, we know what it means to work on interoperability and to cherish diversity. And sometimes you would wish that countries would not forget about their investment when they start doing the investments in their national context, because there is already so much that we have on offer and have experience with. Once more, the use cases come with many angles and diversity, and I think it would be interesting to discuss with you how this type of organizations could contribute further to the fair digital object landscape. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, and now I'd like to invite Sven Bingert up, who's here from GWDG, which if he's brave, he can say he told me not to try.
So, good afternoon. As said, my name is Sven Bingert. I'm from GWDG. I will not try to pronounce completely. You can look it up. It's a very long German name. I'm actually here representing, or somehow this person mentioned in the earlier session, this newcomer, this newbie, not well known, not having so many hats on my head, and not having a long year experience. I'm here in this field only a couple of years. Nevertheless, I have some experience I would like to share with you, and that's why I have also such kind of a nice look-up table here. So GWDG, or GWDG, is a kind of infrastructure provider. Yeah? So we do IT services, we do development, we do coding, we do also persistent identifiers, basically. So we have a lot of contact to all kind of communities, from very low department within a university, universities, communities, up to the European level. So we know that this concept of a data space, as we had before, maybe it's just a buzzword, but it's an interesting buzzword. A data space is required by all of them. Yeah? The persons, the department says we need to have a data space to handle our data within our department, but also on the same level, on the same time, on a European level. Already mentioned before, we have a concept in Germany which is called NFDI, National Research Data Infrastructure, Nationale Forschungsdateninfrastruktur in German. It's a concept where the German government said we have to finance the development of a national-wide infrastructure to handle our data. There is, based on this concept, there were different consortia built up from different communities. So we have, for example, biodiversity, which fits nicely into the surrounding here. And they do provide and do try to solve the same issue. They would like to have a common data space to share, at least on a national level, but also, of course, most of them involved in European or worldwide communities, share their data on these levels. And they do start already now by implementing stuff. Yeah? They have something, at least in the biodiversity consortium, something called Research Data Commons. It's a platform to share and to provide data enhanced with metadata to be actually fair. Yeah? So, and they are not aware of what we're doing here. That's what we had discussed earlier before. We have to have more communities involved, more people, and integrated in the discussions what we are going to do. So what is FDO? I think a lot of people use it on a very high level. So we have this FDO is more at the moment maybe a buzzword, or is it just a digital object which is fair? Is it only the identifier with some metadata, or is it the complete infrastructure, including all the services which can actually do the operations which were mentioned several times before? So if we assign an operation to an object, we should be able to do the operation. And this is something I fear is not yet available. Of course, people do have a lot of these objects which are fair and have some kind of functionalities and services which do act on those, but is not that general as we should have in future. So the question is, what is fair? Is it a loosely coupled collection of repositories providing fair data, having some loosely coupled functions, softwares which can do the operations? Or is it more than that? Or does it have to be more? Or is it just sufficient to say this is somehow loosely coupled collection of these FTOs? If I look again on the perspective of the infrastructure provider, we know that on a very low level that we have to have a contract with those owning the data. And they come to us and say, you can take the data, and we have to make a contract. That brings in all the issues of the intellectual property and the industrial property law problems. So who is actually owning the data? Who is actually allowed to handle the data, maintain the data, provide the data? And as from my experience, I would say we are on a very low level, on the starting level of all these issues. Yeah? So maybe the big infrastructures do handle properly the copyright issue and provide license features, license functionalities, but we are at the starting point. And if you even think on a bigger level, including industry, it might be even more challenging in future. I have a point which wasn't raised here at all. Maybe it's not relevant, but I just would like to make it. So freedom of research. If we, at the moment, a lot of people discuss about the long tail of science. So it's all the data we might not care of, or others say we have to care about this data. But we have also the freedom of research. It means everybody can choose on her or himself how to handle the data, how to treat my data, what kind of tools I would like to use. And we have to be careful that an FDO is not something which is on top and would actually limit this feature of to be an open researcher. Coming back to the question, the role of the FDO Forum, in my perspective, so we have a lot of global acting organizations already since many years, especially in the environment of internet or the web. So we have also the UN, ITU, ISO. But what's not mentioned in the last round was actually we have DONA. DONA is the organization which is at the moment responsible for the handle system. Because of Bianchi is here, for example. There's members from all continents, I guess. So there's a bigger community behind, of course, like this. We have EOSC, which can provide policies. We have the PIT policy, for example, provided by EOSC. So the question about the legal entity, I would actually really postpone. So do we need to have a legal entity? I'm actually open about this. Another thing is that Barnes actually mentioned that data management is a word he doesn't like. It's also a buzzword. But in my point of view, data management is something which is very closely related to FDO. As I said, so if you have in data space which is fair, then you might actually improve all the data management processes and tasks like handling data, but also the governance stuff. And you can benefit in your daily life and basically on all level of people involved in the data management. That means people creating data, people handling the data, and people writing the policies about data. At the end, I would like to mention, there is also mentioned before in the last session, there is a new funding line coming up from the US, from European Commission, where we could have FDOs, but there is already at least two I pretty much involved, I know about, two large projects called Fair Impact and Fair Core for EOSC, both having the name FAIR in their acronym, which are started just recently. Yeah? And we have to take those into account in our future discussion in future involvements. So basically my last statement is, we had a discussion about walking or running. I would say, let's take all the communities we know, take it by hand and go for a walk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sven. And last but not least, I would like to invite up Ingrid Dillo, who's Deputy Director of Data Archiving and Network Services. Sorry, yes, Network Services.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to sit down because I was standing over lunch and I was also standing in the back over the session that we had before this one, so I hope you forgive me that. So let me start by saying that I'm quite a local here. And when I arrived this morning, I was walking up from the station to here. And I was reminded of the fact that 200 meters, about 200 meters from here, two of my boys were born. That was the first thought that came to my mind. And the other thought that came to my mind was that this really is my city of origin, in a sense. This is the place where I went to university for 8 years and was trained as a maritime historian. So I am a humanist. I come from the humanities. And I also remembered how things went in those days. I remember going as a student to the CRI, the center where there was this huge computer, where we learned the basics, where we typed our, how do you call that in English, the ponskaarten, the cards with the holes, the punch cards that went into the machine, etc., etc. And I also remember writing my PhD, having shoe boxes and system cards where I would, give themes to all the findings I did in the archive, etc., etc. And then it's also very nice that we are here in this environment, because my kids then, when I tell them about this, say, "You are really a dinosaur." So you see, we're in the right place. So being a maritime historian, that's a long time ago, and I also made quite a journey, and that journey brings me today here. And as you heard, I am the deputy director of an organization called DANS, which is an organization based in The Hague, and it is a repository that holds data from the social sciences and the humanities. We have been around since 2005, and we are, I would say, we have a medium size, and we try to do the right thing. And nowadays, the right thing is to be fair enabling. And I can tell you that that is an uphill struggle. And it is an uphill struggle for a repository like ours, because just as Franciska was saying, we are dealing with a vast diversity of data, different data types, different data formats, etc., etc. So quite a complicated data holding. And next week we have our half-yearly meeting with our board, and we have been thinking about how we talk to them about the challenges that we face. And these challenges, you could say, concentrate around fair and making our data fair. We are at the moment in an overhaul of our technical services, which is quite a challenge for an organization like us that receives structural funding that doesn't change over the years. So what do? We need to keep up to speed with the technology changes. So we also invest a lot in participation in projects with others, mainly on the European level. And that helps us to keep up to speed with technology, and it also helps us to contribute in a way to that broader community. So many European projects, and one of them is, and that's a nice bridge that Sven made for me, is Fair Impact. This is a project that just kicked off and is a project in which we have 28 partners around Europe, and also different domain-specific organizations. And in that project, which is a coordination and what's the other word? Support action. So we really try to help organizations in Europe to implement FAIR. And how do we do that? We try to catch over the different domains established practices and tools and policies, etc., and try to bring them together with all the partners from one domain to the other. Because I really believe that there is already a lot out there, but a lot of it is also developed within the domains. So what we need to do is open up those domains and get these cross linkages so that we don't keep on reinventing wheels, but that we really try to make use of what we have here and there. What we also try to do as a repository is really to connect with other repositories. And I think that that is another very important element here, because repositories around the world, of course, are the environments in which the data live. And that environment, to a large extent, I think also defines the fairness of the data, because a data set gets a persistent identifier when it is deposited in a repository. There are metadata standards, etc., etc. And we see maybe you know, we have been working within the repository community also to come up with basic standards. We had two. I always like to tell this story because it doesn't happen a lot that you have two standards that come together and turn out to be, come together and work together and leave the door again and have one standard only. That happened with the data seal of approval and the certification mechanism that we had in the World Data System that led to Core Trust Seal. And I would like to mention that because I think when we talk about interoperability, that standardization that is really community based, where the repositories themselves have created that catalog under the umbrella of RDA. We now have 150 repositories almost around the globe that comply with these basic requirements, and because they do, that already creates a level of fairness for the data that live in those repositories. So I have not been here and listening to your conversations over the last 1.5 days, but I did catch some of it. And I'd like to make 2 points. The first one is about this concept of a fair digital object. I think saying a fair digital object is quite neutral. It's a concept that no one will contest, but I also see that there are many interpretations, and I see on the one hand of the spectrum you have definitions like we already had in 2018 in the Turning Fair into Reality report that was quite conceptual, that talked about a fair data object needing to have a persistent identifier, rich metadata, open formats, community standards, etc., etc. We all agree on that. That's not an issue, but the issue is that that is not implementable. I think on the other end of the spectrum, we now see the definition of the FDO Forum that really is more narrow and precise, that is bit-centric, and that relies on the new protocol. And of course, that is closer to implementation, and it has a strong focus on machine actionability. But as far as I've been able to follow and the discussions and sense the room, I also think that there is still a lot that needs to be debated. And to my mind, we need really a community-based process as a next step for this, because in the end, we want to come to a community-supported technology and specifications. And these then can, of course, then be adopted by repositories like us and by infrastructures around the globe. So that is the first point. And the second point, and I might be a little bit of a broken record here, is that, of course, I do recognize the importance of machine actionability. And I know that Barend will say fair data is only fair data when it is really a machine actionable unit. But I think that working at the data repository, fair data is really a complex challenge. And it is not only about technology. There are other nuts to crack, and those nuts may be sometimes even, I think, more difficult to crack. And then I talk about elements like human capacity and cultural change. And in that sense, I would like to mention a couple of numbers to you. In 2 weeks' time, we have the EOSC Symposium in Prague. And there, a report will be presented that was commissioned by the European Commission on the current state of the European research data landscape. And I want to share some of the outcomes of that report with you to illustrate my point. Only 40% of the researchers that were surveyed, and we received responses from 15,000 researchers across all the domains and across all the countries in Europe. Only 40% of them occasionally store data in repositories. 40% have never heard of FAIR. Now, you could argue that that is not an issue. They don't have to know the acronym as long as they follow the FAIR practices. But about 1 out of 5 say that they put FAIR into practice. And when you then ask them about FAIR practices, for example, about adding a license to your data set, only 17% say that they do that. Only 19% say that they acquire a persistent identifier for their data set. and only 27% say that they use common standards for data and metadata. So this only to illustrate that we have a long, long way still to go. And when you ask the researchers, they say they need training and support to be compliant, and they need easy to understand policies, and they struggle to find time and effort to do the work, etc., etc. So my point is, let's not forget that broader picture. When we are amongst a kind of an in crowd, as we are here, talking about technology and the high end of things, there is still a lot of footwork to be done. And then I'll stop.
Super. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. So now we'll move into a few questions, and then those of you who have burning questions, there will be time for those as well, and maybe even a few comments. So let's first turn it back a bit to policies and governance of data spaces. So in order to facilitate the global adoption of FDOs, what might be the main issues concerning control and ownership of data services and infrastructures? It's okay.
I can start. For me, it comes down to how do we, if we're creating this data space, and let's just for the sake of argument to assume that it's something new and it brings all these various data objects together. For me, the challenge is how do we prevent the challenge we have today, which is the abuse of data and with respect to privacy and all of the things that increasingly disenfranchise people from either making their data available through social platforms or other kinds of things. So I think GDPR is a good example of a policy legal framework that sets the bar. It has beautiful exemptions for research when the research is in the public interest in terms of the approach. So I think it's a model. I think it, in order for a global data space to work, I think something like that is absolutely necessary. And then the other one that's a bit more challenging are the in a sense, the human rights legislations and copyright and intellectual property legislations. For example, in Canada, we speak of 4 nations, the nation of Canada, well, 5, because Quebec also calls itself a nation. But then we have 3 indigenous nations, First Nations, Inuit and Métis. And there's been a long history of abuse of the knowledge, traditional knowledge and information, and even research about those indigenous communities. And it's difficult to build a legal framework or a policy framework that prevents that from happening in the future. So for me, those are the 2 critical ones. And then how we deal with the challenges. I mean, most large companies these days have billion-dollar budgets to spend on penalties. So when they get a penalty on the GDPR of 10 million or $1 billion, it's the cost of doing business. So even with those policies and legal frameworks in place, we still have challenges in data space that very difficult.
Yeah. Let me ask a follow-up to that. So if you think about legal and ethical compliance, who are the main players? So I know you mentioned GDPR as a compliance regime, but are there other groups that we should be intersecting with that are already thinking about these things?
My first, can I? Yeah,
yeah, please.
My first reaction when you were still pronouncing the sentence, so not had reached the end yet, was issues related to ethical dimensions of handling data should, in my view, first of all, come from the grassroots environments in which data is being handled. It's the same as before there is a legal framework or a policy framework that is demanding certain things. Otherwise, I mean, theoretically it could be otherwise, but then it will never work out and become widely adopted. It's like with the open access to publications discussion. This has become a policy of funders, and researchers might be struggling with it, but it was a movement that started, was started by researchers. They felt that their materials should be available to anybody because it was created with public resources. So, and that was the strongest movement or element in the movement to make it in the end the success that it here and there is. And I think it's the same with the ethical issues. If the people doing the data handling haven't got a clue about why this should be taken into account, then you will never manage to get it working. So first of all, the question is, do we have a common understanding of the ethical dimensions? Do we talk a lot and enough about it so that people that work with data, create data, reuse data, are aware of things that could be important?
Yeah, you bring up some good issues. I mean, of course, we're all most of us are at institutions with institutional review boards, but I think, do we have anyone from industry here still? Maybe not, so then we don't have to talk about it. But I don't yes, but you don't have an IRB that you talk to, I assume, and so maybe this is an open question of, is it just your institution, or are there larger bodies? Who's telling you should care about the care principles and checking to make sure that you've really included? I know that we have the Data Science Journal has said they won't publish articles unless you've not only taken the care principles into account, but you also need to have the owners of the data as authors on the papers. But if it's not publishers, if it's not our institutions, maybe this is a gap. And I'm sorry, Sven, you had a thought bubble.
Oh, fine, but at least so there's something in Canada which is quite close to GDPR. I forgot the acronym. But the problem already starts in not you can assign licenses to data. This is pretty much straightforward. You get some tutorial, some teaching, what a license means and how to pick one. But at the moment, it looks like that the research environment is not even able to work on a proper legal way. So if the tools we are at hand at the moment don't actually comply to what we need to have. So there's two fields actually: working as a researcher and also working with data as a researcher. This is two different fields, and for the ethical problems, they are quite after the GDPR. Even if you are GDPR conform, you still can violate ethical aspects very easily. And this is only maybe only works when you really teach young people about these issues.
Exactly. I think that the institution has a role to play, but the peers, the community itself, and training the researchers in their group of peers is also a very important element in this puzzle.
Sure, Mark.
Well, I was just going to comment with an example in the Canadian context. So institutions and researchers are obviously critical in this question. In Canada, generally in a university, and it varies, but generally in the collective agreements, the individual researcher owns their research data. So that's part of their collective agreement, which is a contractual obligation with the institution. Then you have the funders, and the funders give money to the researchers to carry out their research. And there are two contexts I find very interesting. One is the research ethics. And in Canada, IRBs, there are research ethics boards. A researcher has a research idea. Before they go forward for funding, it has to go through the research REB, as we call it in Canada. So you can't even approach a funder until you get approval. And that's the institutional obligation that has been set by the funder. The funders in Canada also have a mandate that says, as a researcher, as a recipient of funding from this national research agency, you must deposit your final publication in an open access repository. So in the first case, the researchers comply, because you can't even apply. In the second case, they just kind of, go whatever. And the compliance to the open access mandate is probably in the low double digits, like 11% or 12%.
Wow.
Because there is no there is no other repercussion. You can get your next grant. You can go to another agency in the same framework and get a different kind of grant. So it's not like some of the philanthropic organizations that are increasingly saying, if you don't meet the mandate we set when you got our funding, such as open access deposit, you will be ineligible for funding for the next 5 years or 10 years. So it's a very complex policy framework with all kinds of challenges, but I just wanted to make that comment with an example from
Well,
Canada.
and if I can ask, and you can say I don't want to say answer, but if you were in charge of everything, at least in Canada, how would you change this to realign incentives or, the stick to the carrot? What would you do?
I'm so glad you said stick and carrot because I hate the analogy because researchers will use it to say, that's a stick, you can't beat me, so go away. So I use the little carrots and big carrots because everybody likes carrots.
And what did we just eat? All of us.
So the little carrot is the personal incentive, promotion and tenure, whatever it is. And the big carrot is the societal benefit that comes from open science or open data. So I would make sure that there were things in place that ensured that both the little carrots and the big carrots were effectively acted on and followed through on. So if you don't deposit your article in an open access repository, and now the latest funding as it is mandate in Canada is similar to the US, you also have to deposit your data in a repository. So I would just have follow-throughs that a box is ticked by a machine actionable fair digital object somewhere that says there was compliance or there wasn't. And when it says there wasn't, then the grant management system says no the next time you apply.
All right. Well, you heard it here, and hopefully these ideas will proliferate out. And maybe you should even talk to the people who are working on the machine actionable DMPs, because I think this is some of the concept too, right? Okay. So I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions. Maybe one last one, though. Sven, what you suggested was really interesting about DONA as an organization. Can you give us any examples of other groups who've become part of DONA or precedents to follow, or is there a process, or what, did you just mean to be provocative? But I did want to move it along as an idea.
I would be, the idea was more to be provocative. I think it would be Christoph's task to actually answer this question, probably. But as I mentioned already, there is a protocol, for example, which is, so to say, provided or specified and under the hood of DONA, and it's just a good example as an organization to provide further specification and so on. Yeah, but when I prepared for this, I couldn't come up with a better similar organization I could actually mention.
No, I thought it was an interesting comment, and that's why I wanted to make sure it didn't get lost with all of the other interesting comments. Okay, so we have some time for questions if people aren't too tired from just having eaten lunch. There will be coffee after this too, so don't lose hope. Okay, so any hands in the audience? I do have my own questions, but I just didn't want to monopolize the time. Okay. Is that you, Wilbert? Okay. Right here. Okay, the microphone is coming.
And there's one over there after that, Christine.
Kiss him. Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're blinded again. Yeah.
All right, thank you everybody for the interesting comments. I just thought we talked earlier about the global landscape and all the global partners, and one thing that I'm thinking about from the NIH point of view often is data sharing and trust across different countries and different stakeholders. And so I'm curious what the panel thinks. I know in the context of the fair digital objects and the idea of data visiting, and that there are technical ways to deal with countries, partners, clinical data systems, etc., that are worried about abuse of their data or infringement of privacy, their patient-informed consent systems, and things like that. So what is the experience of all of you if you've been working on data systems already? in that landscape? Do you see that these organizations in different countries and the kind of broad heterogeneous landscape that we're dealing with, are people getting on board with these ideas? Are they opening up, kind of? Or do you see, because we've also seen in some other places, kind of a locking down of data access or specimen access because of international issues and concerns? So I'm just kind of seeing, in the context of the fair digital object, in the context of the technical possibilities, kind of, do you see openings or do you see challenges, or what do you see in that kind of very broad heterogeneous landscape of rules and regulations and governance structures around data access?
Thanks, Wilbert. That's a great question. I think if we had a word cloud from everything that had been said so far in every session, silo was a very big word that's been used many times. But would any of you like to comment? Please, Sven.
I would have a short comment, basically. I agree, this is a very interesting, very complicated task and topic. But is FDO actually meaning open data, which is, I think, a completely different topic, different task. FDO is just make it machine actionable, and we need to be able to understand all the regulations and topics you mentioned, like privacy and so on, still having this fair digital object available, also the description of it. And then you can sort of say, build a global space on it. Even though, and in my point of view, actually, people try, independent of the discipline they are coming from, medicine or physics, whatever, they try to be open as much as they can. Even though there's clinical data, the anonymized, pseudonymized, and so on. So the trend is there, of course. And FDO is just a tool which still can sort of say have a non-open data.
Thank you. Anyone else? Please, Mark.
Maybe just a practical example that kind of has risen to the top of my list. I don't know that it worked very well, but a lot of you will have noticed when you logged in, when you got here, you saw the edge room. And for those of you for whom it worked, you got logged into the Wi-Fi and life was good. So I was talking with colleagues about this idea of something called Res Roam, for Research Roam, which basically is the idea that when I'm visiting an institution like this, virtually or physically, my Res Roam profile, which would go through the same institutional authentication that happens for EduRoam, knows which department I'm in, it knows which grants I have, it knows which partnerships my institution has signed with other organizations around the world. Sounds complicated, actually not that difficult, and we have all the technical underpinnings to accomplish that. So as I was talking about this with people, I attended a session on the AAI project in EOSC, and I just went, well, that's Res Roam, it's done.
No.
So it actually is, I think, a very nice, nothing is perfect, but it, I think, is a nice, elegant authentication, authorization, interchange protocol that could be used to accomplish that kind of functionality. So if I'm a clinician from this institution, which has a research partnership with the University of Leiden, and I virtually or physically visit the institution, then I immediately have access to the clinical health record data that is part of that research program. Otherwise, I have to go through all kinds of pontifical blessings and all kinds of other things to get access. So I think that's a really practical, important contribution from the European community and EOSC in particular that I'm excited about talking with the technical people in the Alliance already about how we can effect a pilot partnership to see how we can see extra European collaboration.
I can add a bit to that, because in CLARIN we do have a federated login system working already for many years, and the way it works is that people with an academic account can get access to everything that is open for research purposes. People that don't have an academic account can still ask for access, but sometimes have to go to the service provider. It's a distributed data facility. And also in case of sensitive data, additional checks are in place, but especially the data that is open for research is open for anybody with an academic account, precisely for the reasons that you mentioned. and it has been implemented and it works. Yeah.
And Géant has been doing
Yeah.
good work there. And
Yeah.
did you say you're from NIH, as in National Institutes of Health?
Mhm.
And I mentioned the Smart API earlier, which sounds completely unrelated, but what the Smart API does is it provides a registry of fair APIs, i.e. all of these different research infrastructures and data repositories out in data space, and the rules under which they operate, which then get overlaid with my personal credentials and partnerships. So that's another example of a beautiful piece of work that nobody seems to have been paying a lot of attention to, and I mention it a lot because I think it's a critical part of achieving a machine actionable FDO idea.
So before we go to Andrew, how about the philosophical nugget in Wilbert's question? Do you see that people are moving more towards sharing? It sounds like capabilities are enabling that, but are people more open to this, or is it moving the other direction?
This was very much the technical component, I think, of it. But if you look at the social component, that social component, to me, trust is the key word for everything, for collaboration, and that trust can only be built when you have complete transparency and when you have community buy-in. And I think these elements are not only about technology, they are also very much about culture, about people. So I think that is a component that we shouldn't forget.
Oh. And of course, there's the distinction between data that has been generated as part of a research project and data that is available anyhow and has been processed and annotated and enriched as part of a project. And then, of course, the question is, are people willing to share the annotated versions? And in the context that I know best, people are interested in sharing the data because it will enable the comparative perspective, for example, across languages. So if somebody, and one of the types of data that we've been promoting a lot is in principle open data type, namely parliamentary data. All countries have their parliamentary data available in some open format. Or people working in CLARIN try to make sure that the metadata and annotation of that material is harmonized so that you can do comparative research. They're all very enthusiastic for sharing their annotation layer because of the fact that it is presented as a harmonized data set, they get more leverage for the visibility of their own materials.
That's wonderful. So it's a little and a big carrot at the same time. Okay, and thanks for waiting. Andrew Hoffman.
Thanks for a super interesting conversation. I'm Andrew Hoffman, like Christine said. I'm a data steward, and I work across the street at Leiden University, but I'm not probably one of the data stewards that most of y'all are talking about. I spend half of my time working with people, largely working with qualitative data, anthropologists and sociologists, and we're talking about taking hand notes while in the field. So I just wanted to pick up on Mark's last comment about the sort of, possible requirement of depositing data in a repo somewhere, and what the limits of that might be in your mind. And I'd also be curious to hear Ingrid's sort of thoughts on this as well, thinking beyond tabular data or a lot of the quote-unquote data that we've been talking about over the past week here, and to think also about like I said, field notes that are taken in anthropological settings that have lots of contextual information, because as a data steward in these fields, just getting people to give an idea or an impression of the kinds of questions I get in reviewing data management plans. The other day I received one where one of the questions is about metadata standards, and the comment that I got back from the researcher I was working with is, what is a metadata standard? So, and I think this gets to trust. So if you can sort of, what are the limits of the mandates to deposit vis-a-vis questions of trust vis-a-vis, and trust in this whole process from the researcher's perspective, vis-a-vis, the culture change, I guess. Sorry, that was a lot, but hopefully you can pick something out and respond to it.
Good question. And just quickly, before Ingrid goes, the new data management policy from our tri-councils, which are the social sciences, humanities is one, natural sciences and engineering is another, and health science is the other. So their joint policy basically says you have to deposit your data in a repository. So it doesn't say as open data. It doesn't say it has to be in an open repository. So the policy is intended to cover off the issues like preservation of the data. So it may be that you put it in a highly secure data repository that only your institution has access to, or some secure health data repository. So the policy doesn't say it has to be open. So that would respect the need, whatever the interests of the researcher is, for all of the reasons that researchers sometimes can't share data, whether it's forever or for a short time. So I think that's just a short remark on the nature of that particular mandate.
Yeah, I think what you are sketching here is a situation that I recognize pretty well. And I think it also relates to what I said before, that when you ask the researchers, many of them say what we need is support. And I think that support usually is best given locally, so by you in Leiden at the university, close to the researcher. I think in this case, this is also very much about raising awareness and training. It's really the basics. And of course, there are lots of tools and approaches and best practices around to help researchers. But there is also the point, what's in it for them? Why should they, if they come from, that angle of... and I think, Franciska, you gave a nice example of where there is a direct benefit for the researcher themselves. But if they don't see that, it is a difficult thing to sell, to say you need to do this for the good of the world, right? And there I think it's very important that we now have a process to rethink the academic credits that people get, so that also the fact that you put extra effort in making your data available and depositing them in a repository is rewarded in some way. And of course, that doesn't have to be open. That's also, in our own repository, there are things to choose there. But it all boils down to providing training, awareness, close to the researcher. Yeah.
Thank you. Great question. Okay. How about right here in front? And the microphone is traveling to you.
Good afternoon. Thanks for an amazingly interesting and relevant conversation. I fully understand that, the conversation and the discussion focuses on public sector funded research, and that there's a lot of things to do in order to, create repositories, etc. I'm in the field of life sciences, and the biggest and probably the best organized databases reside in the public sector, in the private sector. So, to your analogy of the small and the bigger carrots, how can we actually incentivize or seduce the private sector to embark on this journey so that all of these data and databases basically become reusable and accessible for research, because there's a wealth of potential information there.
Anyone want to talk about the seduction of private data companies?
They're not here, you can just speak out freely.
Yes.
It's so, in Canada, a very commonly discussed example is agricultural equipment manufacturers, tractors and combines and all the rest, that produce a wealth of data about tilling practices and you name it, where the crops are, all that kind of stuff. So, and it's theirs. So when I pay $600,000 for a fancy new combine, I don't own the data that comes from it, which can only come from my activities in that combine in the field. So it's a very weird example. So in Canada, what we're trying to do is create private sector, public sector partnerships. For example, that might partner with the colleges in Canada are they do applied research, and almost always their funded research is done in collaboration with a private sector partner. So one of the things we're trying to do is encourage the John Deeres and those private sector partners in the agri-food industry to partner with universities and colleges so that they can see when data is open, the kind of incredible innovation and entrepreneurial activity that comes from, you know, the 18-year-old first-year university student in Canada who created the first COVID-19 tracking application. It's just, you know, who knows who's going to do what. So we're trying to encourage that, but it's really, really hard. Because, and even the universities are terrible at encouraging companies to emerge out of open concepts, whether it's open source or open data. They're all about trademarks and patents and all of those things that stretch back hundreds of years. So it's a really hard nut, but I think if we can convince everybody that open data would lead to a better economic output for everybody, then I think things will change, but it's going to take a while. It's a tough one.
Yeah, thank you. And you brought up some other wonderful points. There are examples of things where people work in pre-competitive spaces for just the reasons that Mark talks about. The Machine Learning Commons is the one that comes to mind for me. You have 100 organizations, 80 plus companies, all the big tech companies participating because they realize that it's not worth their time to test out every new processor and every new deep learning stack. And so they share data about that. I think the other thing, actually now that we're talking, is we should spend some time in data engineering communities. I think the FDO architecture has tremendous potential for working with data engineers to speed up some of the new technologies. Any of you who've tried to work with graph databases know that's 20 or 30 years behind where we need it to be to match with the volume of data. So maybe this is a way we get industry excited if we convince them that there's a way to save money, time, and energy.
There's a question over there.
Oh, yes, please. Mark.
Yeah, it's a commercial software guy. Hi.
Are you seduced by our answers?
Why do you think I'm here then? No, there's a really good, can I just give an example just to your questions? How do you seduce these people? We did it, the world is run on enlightened self-interest, if you ask me. And we had, in the UK, we have a crazy train infrastructure where the people who own the tracks don't run the trains and they don't have the stations. For some reason, they thought that was a good idea back in the 80s sometime. Anyway, the point was the people who ran the trains wanted to get the data from the infrastructure people when they weren't prepared to share it. And then the infrastructure people just dropped something into the conversation. They said, we'd really like to know where the electricity spikes on the lines because that's really dangerous for us. And the people who ran the train says, yeah, we know that because we run the trains up and down this line 25 times a day. That's how you get them. Yeah, you get them by, I've got something that you want, you've got something that I want. You have to find the key. Yeah, that's the thing. It's the altruism problem. This is why should I bother? That's what, in our experience, it comes from enlightened self-interest. Yeah. I've got something you want, you've got something I want. You know, now we're in a negotiation.
And universities have something that industry wants. No?
Yeah, yeah.
Namely students.
Brains.
Yes, brains,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah, no, so that's the thing. You know, just leverage that. So.
Okay, and right here. Sharif, I think.
Thank you. Hi, this is Sharif from Naturalis. I want to make a comment about ethics and privacy, sort of the way you're describing here. So one thing to recognize is that ethics and privacy is very context specific. And of course, there's a lot of research going on from the computer science and the cryptography world about, you know, private data and things like that. But when it comes to implementation, sometimes those sort of context-specific things, I think we miss it. So one example I'm seeing in the European projects that we usually get a work package focused on ethics, and the way it's constructed, usually it's the people that lead those ethics work packages, the other gender, and compared to the technical, you know, work packages, and you know where I'm going with this. So basically, it becomes an afterthought, you know, in this whole work package system that we are used to in the European projects. So, is there any other alternative way where we're thinking about those things sort of with the technical work packages, with the deliverables, rather than a separate stream that you just have to check mark and produce a report.
So almost as analogous as people complain to the data stewards aren't included till the end when they have to try and curate garbage. Like, how do you bring in the ethics at the beginning?
Exactly.
No, these are hard questions. It's not like you can rattle off 5 examples of, oh, these projects are doing it great. But how could it work? Can you imagine? Do the ethics of some of this data that's being collected, the parliamentary data, ever come up where it's all open?
That's open. We focus mainly on data that is open or can be made open under conditions.
But is the
but
metadata?
But there is, of course, ethics in all kinds of aspects of academic workflow. So I can't say that it's not an issue.
Well, how about when students are adding metadata? I mean, there must be times with American politics they wanted to say crazy, like attached to clips.
They can do that. They can do that, of course.
But are there any ethicists that work alongside to say, okay, that's not an objective way to say it? Say nonsensical might be a better word.
Well, I think this is not... this is not the ethics of science, I think. I mean, you can say these things. The question is whether your peers are interested in that type of annotation. That is part of the... that decides whether or not the material gets the stamp of quality that you may be looking for. But if there is... a lot of data with these kind of less standard or less normalized annotations, it is interesting in itself.
Yes.
So we would like to collect it for that reason.
And maybe my example is more Reddit than something that happens at a university. So apologies there. Sharif, you've given us a lot to think about, so thank you. We will hang on to that. Okay, we have time for maybe one last question. Okay, please. And here it comes.
It's a different panel, the same question that I asked yesterday, but rather an upgrade. Yesterday I said, whose responsibility is it to make the data fair? Now, if I upgrade it, leave the researchers be. You know, you don't want fishermen to go to the market and sell the fish and learn the marketing tactics. They are good at research, leave them be. But now there's a push for research support. And those are mostly the people who have a background, have a PhD, have done research, so they understand the arena. So how about we make them responsible, or let's say give them the mandate to make the data fair? They have the knowledge. There's a big community here building the tools for them. I don't understand why we have to show the big, small carrot to the researchers. They are drowning in their own problems as it is. So if you had to present a scenario tomorrow where the researchers are not in the equation, what would that be? What would that look like? Because I think that will really speed up the process. And also, not every researcher is going to have a permanent position. They need different jobs. So this would be the way for them to go forward. But I don't see any discussions around that.
Well, I think it was part of the discussion that was brought up either by Mark or by Ingrid about the reward system for people working in academia that are now hopefully starting to understand the importance and the added value of sharing data according to common standards. That needs to be recognized when they have to undergo some assessment, when they are applying for another job. It should be part of their CV and recognized as value. That's a discussion that in many places in the world is taking place, and many funding organizations are adopting new standards so that it's not only about publication output, why people are being granted a new project, etc. So these things are being discussed and will gradually, I know gradually, can take a long time, get better.
But is there a way for us to put more momentum to it? I was at a conference where this discussion also happened, but the conclusion was like, oh, great idea, something should happen about it. At least I don't feel the momentum in my day-to-day work. the way I feel the momentum, oh, data has to be fair and so on. I personally do not feel that momentum.
Yeah, there are maybe people.
Just a quick response, but coming back to the question just before yours, I don't think you can take the researcher out of the equation. I think the researcher, for various reasons, and I'll just give an example from the Canadian context. And I know, but before I do that, I'll just say the researcher shouldn't have to make their data fair generally. It should just be part of the infrastructure that they use. So I agree with you there. So in Canada, I mentioned the Indigenous challenge previously. There's around 400 First Nations communities in the country. When you're a researcher and you're doing research about or with that community, then there are certain things you need to do before you engage that community in that research. And the general moniker is research with us, not about us. So in that context, there's, like the international care principles, there's First Nations in Canada have something called the OCAP principles, very similar to CARE. So as a funder, when we launch our next funding call, one of the requirements, and these are research infrastructure funding calls, one of the requirements will be an articulation of how your proposal intersects with the OCAP principles and the data sovereignty interests of the 3 nations in Canada. And when we first articulated this intent to the research community, they go, oh my God, I've got so many other things to worry about. I don't even know if my research has an impact on First Nations, Indigenous, or data sovereignty. Exactly.
Well, that's a great note.
End of the conversation.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on. Panelists have given us a lot to think about. All of your questions were wonderful as well. Before I send you off to the break, I know it's late on a Friday and we have one more session. This isn't one of those normal conferences where it's like, oh, let's just blow this off and go to the pub. Because we have some exciting things. There's a musical denouement, which I'm excited to find out what that is. I think I saw them practicing. So if you weren't here for the beginning, people were kissed by computers. So we're very excited to see what happens next. We have a lovely closing session planned for you. And I believe wine after? Yeah, there's gonna be wine after. So please stick around. 30-minute break. Thank you. Oh.